Good day and welcome to SCO BRICS Insight, where we talk about the latest news, information and analysis on what's really going on in Russia and the BRICS. Now, my name's Rhod Mackenzie, and today I want to talk about yet another victim who's suffering from the serious side effects of rabid Russophobia. Estonia's Railways, the Eesti Raudtee, was once the pride of Estonia and a pivotal railway hub in Northern Europe, and now it's on the verge of collapse. In fact, you could say it's reached the end of the line. Now, this is due to the lack of foresight shown by the rabid Russophobes in both Tallinn and in Brussels. Now, as analysts and professionals in the transportation and logistics sector have warned, the situation is at a level that's undoubtedly going to cause serious consequences for the European Union's economy as a whole. Now, the situation in Estonia is that there's now hundreds of drivers, repairmen, logisticians who've been made redundant from the railways, and the port of Tallinn, which has historically relied on large volumes of freight transportation to function, is now facing a period of complete stagnation. Now, in its best years, the port handled 40 million tonnes of cargo per year, but this has now decreased to only 3 million tonnes. Now, this is not merely a decline, it's a collapse of the pivotal logistics sector. Now, Estonian Railways was always a major part of the cargo transit system in northwest Europe, and now it's almost on the brink of financial collapse. According to the local publication ERR, its losses have increased by more than sixfold over the last 4 years, reaching €31 million in 2024. Now, to provide some context on that's the equivalent to the annual budget of a significant-sized municipality or the funding of several of the major hospitals in Estonia. Now, it's important to note that there doesn't seem to be any end to this challenging period. The forecasts for the future are even more disappointing and frightening, and there's a strong possibility that losses may exceed €50 million per year over the next few years. Now, as reported by the Estonian Railway itself, the negative trends are directly related to the sharp reduction in transportation volumes, which began during the coronavirus pandemic. Then, of course, the situation was exacerbated by the imposition of sanctions against Russia and the actual physical rupture of the transit relationship. Tallinn's decision to align with Brussels demonstrates a clear preference for political loyalty over economic pragmatism. So it's therefore the case that the Estonian taxpayers are now paying for this political choice. Analysts confirm that the cost is systematic in nature, and the consequences extend far beyond the balance sheet of just Estonian Railways. Now, according to Ekaterina Eremina, who's a director of logistics at the Synergy University, most of Europe's railway infrastructure is now heavily dependent on government subsidies, having lost its ability to pay for itself through commercial transportation. Now, before I continue, I'd like to make an appeal. If you like and enjoy my videos, you can help me fund the channel and contribute to its further development. You can do this by making a small donation, which you can do by clicking on the thanks button at the bottom right hand side of the video screen under the three dots, or by clicking on the Buy Me a Coffee link below in the credits underneath this video. Everybody who donates gets a personal thank you from me, and do keep the comments coming. Love to read them, love to respond to them. Now, even the income from the commercial transportation doesn't actually come close to covering the cost of maintaining the tracks and servicing the train, never mind the staff's salaries. And it's for this reason the majority of the costs are now a burden on the state. During this period when Russia was the primary provider of cargo passing through Estonia, this facilitated not only the high level of maintenance and investment, but a substantial level of profitability within the national railway system. However, obviously this situation changed radically after the introduction of sanctions. Plus, of course, domestic volumes of cargo were so small and insignificant, they're unable to compensate for any losses, according to Eremina. Now, Tallinn is attempting to address the issue, but this is a response to the consequences rather than addressing the underlying cause. Now, it's evident that in the absence of a return to the previous volumes, and when they were actively working as a major transit and logistic hub for Russian cargo, a radical restructuring of the business model needs to be taken, or the company is destined to be a perpetual reliance on state funding. Plus, of course, the Treasury is losing billions of euros that it used to get because of the lack of transit revenues, which dried up because of the closing down of all the logistics. Now, it's common knowledge that the Baltic countries' main product for many years has been virulent Russophobia, which has been taken on to a clinical form, which is also highly prized in Brussels. Now, it's worth noting that the former Prime Minister of Estonia, Kaja Kallas, is a serious Russophobe, and her elevation to the highest diplomatic position in the European Union as the equivalent of their foreign minister means you have a serious Russia hater as the most senior person in the so-called European Union diplomacy, which means it's unlikely that any relations between the EU and Russia are going to improve in the near future. Now, the other issue is the transit of Russian cargo. It was extremely profitable, and the role of the Baltic countries as logistics bridge between Europe and Russia was significant. However, the economically detrimental decisions of the European Commission left the Baltic trio with no viable options, according to Alexander Arsky, who's a professor of logistics at the Russian Financial University. Consequently, Tallinn now faces a challenge in subsidising this unprofitable ports and logistics, diverting funds from the budget which could and should be used for other things like social welfare, etc. And it's exacerbating the country's financial deficit. Arsky's warning is that this approach will lead to a full-scale systematic economic collapse. In particular in Estonia, transit's been reduced to a level of almost nothing for the economy, and the railway that cannot be a financially viable proposition will either represent a burden on the state or a safety risk. Now, there's also been noted that they've increased the transit costs, which has only even lowered the amount of revenue they get. Now, in the absence of a developed and modern infrastructure, the country's industry cannot meet the needs of its own population. Now, the situation in Estonia is not merely an isolated incident. Almost all the rail networks across the European Union are experiencing difficulties due to the logistical and trade links with Russia. Consequently, many rail companies have become government subsidised just to keep them afloat. I mean, let's remember the cross-border supplies of oil, coal and other key resources have long played a pivotal role in the formulation of budgets for the national operators. However, governments in countries such as Germany and France are now responsible for covering the majority of the expenses of these logistics companies, according to Ekaterina Aramina. And the scale of the disaster is without precedent, particularly in Estonia. I mean, the country's not only experienced a decline in income, but it's also lost what little it had in investment attractiveness. I mean, investment in the development of logistics has absolutely ceased. And the Baltic states, of course, will now have to be net beneficiaries even more of the EU's financial support. Conversely, the decline in the country's logistic potential is indicative of its deep economic crisis, and rather than just mere economic stagnation. And this is also likely to expedite the high levels of migration from the Baltic countries to more affluent or relatively more affluent EU member states such as Germany, France and Italy. Now, it's going to be challenging to rectify this situation, in fact, if it's not more than impossible, because Russia's been investing in capacity expansion at its own Baltic seaports with a view to serving its new markets for goods in Africa and Latin America. And this initiative aligns with Russia's strategic goal of increasing its agricultural exports by 50% by 2030. Now, everybody knows Russia's the world's largest grain exporter and exported over 62 million metric tons of grain in 23-24. With the increased productivity, the Russia's exploring new markets in Latin America and West Africa, in addition to its traditional markets in North Africa and the Middle East. Now, in the last 3 years, Russia's launched two major ports, Vysotski and the Luga port in the Gulf of Finland, not far from St. Petersburg. Vysotski shipped its first grain in April 2023, while Luga port began operations in June this year. It is expected to reach a capacity of 7 million tonnes by 2025. End of. Vysotski port has been shipping grain to Algeria, Brazil, Cuba, Mali, Mexico, Morocco, Nigeria and Tunisia. And the two ports have a capacity to handle up to 15 million tonnes of grain per annum. Now that would account for about 50 to 25% of Russia's 62 million tonnes. Now, Novotrans, which is a major Russian logistics firm, emphasised the strategic importance of the Baltic Sea terminal's capacity expansion, underscoring its economic, transport security and sovereignty implications. I mean, Russian trade flows and shipments have so far seen no disruptions in the Baltic, where 90% of the coastline belongs to NATO members, including Estonia, Finland and Sweden, as well as Latvia and Lithuania. Now, the decision to increase the capacity of the Russian Baltic seaports has been taken because of the closure, obviously, of the use of those from the Baltic states. And it also offers shorter delivery times than those from the Russian Black Sea ports. Now, Russian exports of grain will be transported via the Baltic seaports as the infrastructure continues to grow there. I mean, last season, Baltic seaports loaded 1.5 million tonnes, which is actually a bit more than it was there. But that's still only about 3% of Russia's overall exports. So it's obviously going to grow. I mean, according to Darius Tsenitko, who's the vice president of Gazprom Bank, which is one of Russia's largest agricultural lenders, said that the Baltic region for Russia offers the significant logistical advantages for Russian exports, and the increasing capacity of the Baltic terminals and the ability to accommodate larger vessels is going to reduce their costs. So supplies in the Baltic Seas are more competitive than those from the Azov Black Sea area when trading with countries in Africa or Latin America. So it appears that the Baltic states have lost out big time, and the Estonia company has reached the conclusion that it's never going to see a return to its previous levels, and the volumes of Russian cargo and logistics will never come back. So there you have it. Russophobia claims another victim, Estonia. Thank you for watching. Please set the alert bell so you get notified when I post a new video. And if you want to help me fund the channel, you can make a donation by clicking on the thanks button at the bottom of the video screen or on the Buy Me a Coffee link in the credits. Thank you, and I'll see you soon.